In my last segment, I used new Bronze Age DNA samples from the steppes of Russia to prove that the rise of the Greek and Latin languages cannot be explained by migration or invasion from that part of the world. On the contrary, I showed that we probably migrated to the Middle Volga region of European Russia, called Tatarstan today. That means we were in their backyard, not the other way around. In that segment, I used a random spread of nodes to show what this trade network might have looked like when it was active. Now, in this segment, I'm going to add a confirmed node to this network, here in modern-day Serbia, Western Hungary, and Eastern Croatia. I'm also going to adjust the network in the center to reflect more activity in the region surrounding Moscow. You'll see why very soon. The paper I'm using as a foundation for this segment is a PhD dissertation by Anna Sezenyi-Nagy, which I've probably mispronounced. I apologize for that if I have. Molecular Genetic Investigation of the Neolithic Population History in the Western Carpathian Basin. Also in this segment, I'm going to throw away a lot of my old ideas about who was where and when. There were a lot more migrations going on than I thought in my last two segments, and in many respects, those who hold to the steppe hypothesis of the Indo-European language have turned out to be right, and I have turned out to be wrong. In fact, when all is said and done, it looks like those guys are going to win virtually all of the battles, but lose the war. But before I get into that, let me walk you through how we typically organized our societies, both before and after my theoretical trade network on the steppes. Here at settlements like Çatalhöyük, we all ate different food and built our homes of different material, and even had several distinct artistic lineages. About 6500 BC, this site alone reached a peak population of 10,000 people, which would be a world record unmatched for the next 3,000 years. And we did all that without a single sign of hierarchy. While we were there, we saw Mount Hassan erupt, and this here is the first map in the world memorializing that eruption. Get used to that. We have a lot of important firsts under our belt. Some scholars think this is a leopard skin hanging up with the extremities cut off. It looks like it, but it could be both. The mountain was 70 miles away. I bet they thought it was growling. Apparently, in the Neolithic, we evolved a real knack for large-scale social cohesion with just the right amount of overhead to allow us to thrive as creative individuals. My proposed Stone Age network in European Russia is just the natural fruit of that special gift, and it would only be the first of many such trade and social networks we would later create. As I walk you through some of these networks, I'm going to read passages from the Cambridge Companion to the Aegean Bronze Age, pages 47, 51, and 54 through 55. They cover our immigration to the Cyclades Islands nestled between Crete, mainland Greece, and Turkey. Settling here was trickier than you'd think, and the skills that we mastered at Çatalhöyük helped us pull this off. I'll let this one speak for all of our migrations. The early Bronze Age of the Cycladic Islands occupies a remarkable place in Aegean history, out of all proportion to the modest numbers of people who inhabited them. Why have these 30-odd islands enjoyed so much attention? Their average size is a mere 75 square kilometers. Many are far smaller, and the largest island, Naxos, is hardly a giant in Aegean terms. Even if all the Cyclades are added together, the resultant circa 2,580 square kilometers is a fraction of Crete or the Peloponnese. Nor, under early Bronze Age conditions, did these islands offer obviously inviting opportunities for settlement. The rugged masses of rock that make up the Cyclades are, save in a few fertile valleys and coastal plains, thinly covered with soil and short of water. They occupy the poorest end of the spectrum of viable environments for farming communities. The Cycladic Islands were probably visited seasonally for fish and obsidian by mobile hunter-gatherer groups based elsewhere. This situation may have lasted well into the Neolithic. The advent of farming triggered a gradual impetus to island settlement throughout the Aegean, because domesticated animals and plants boosted islands' viability for year-round habitation. Yet there is to date no sign of established communities resident in the Cyclades until the late and final Neolithic, 5200 to 3100 BC. Maybe earlier Neolithic antecedents will be discovered, but the first people who at the moment merit the title of Cycladic Islanders are those of the late Neolithic Saliagos culture, which dates roughly to the 5th millennium BC. With the exception of a few markedly larger early Cycladic II settlements, the overwhelming impression of early Cycladic I and II is of numerous small settlements dispersed over the landscape. The size of a typical settlement was a mere fraction of a hectare, 10,000 square meters or about 2.5 acres, as shown by excavated examples. The inhabitants of such farmsteads and hamlets should number from one to a handful of families. This pattern is replicated in many marginal Aegean environments during the Bronze Age. It is a good risk-spreading response to the unpredictable dangers of localized droughts, harvest failure, and other disasters, especially if coupled with social networks that provided for help in adversity. This social necessity could explain the proliferation of small prestige objects exchanged in the Cyclades at this time. Just how few people there were in the islands becomes apparent if we multiply the likely population of a typical settlement by the approximate number of such settlements on an island, allowing for the probability that not all were simultaneously occupied. The survey data from Milos and less strictly quantifiable data from other islands agree in suggesting densities of between one half to 3 people per square kilometer, with increases in settlement numbers between early Cycladic I and II, created by fissioning of communities. The implications are startling. For average size islands such as Sifnos and Seriphos, around 74 to 75 square kilometers, it follows that the expected population is about 37 to 225 people. The largest island should have attained populations of over 1,000 people, but musters for the small islands are unlikely to have exceeded double digits, and pancycladic totals probably remain below 10,000 people. What do such numbers tell us? First, in light of the anthropological indications that only populations of at least 300 to 500 people can remain self-sufficient in marriage partners and reproduction over an extended duration, it transpires that most islands, and of course settlements, were demographically dependent on inter-island contacts for long-term survival. Second, the Cycladic figures are low in comparison with the biggest centers of burgeoning population, wealth, and power elsewhere in the Aegean. For example, the roughly 1,290 to 1,940 people who may have lived at Knossos during the early Minoan II are equivalent to several medium-sized islands put together. For those of us living on or around the steppes of Russia, the situation would not have been much different. Now that we've embedded Széchenyi Nagy's paper into a broader social context, let's get back to it. She surveys the genetic and archaeological heritage of 6 different Neolithic cultures in southeastern Europe. The first Neolithic culture in southeastern Europe is the Starchevo, which stretched from 6200 to 5400 BC. The second is the linear bond ceramic, LBK. She also targets the linear bond ceramic culture as it manifested in the Trans-Danubia region, LBKT, the darker red. This was where the culture actually started. And as you can see, it was very influential. It went from 5600 to 4800 BC. The Vinča culture then rose up in the south on the old Starchevo territory that remained, 5500 to 4500 BC. The Vinča were heavily influenced by them in the beginning. Both groups originally came from Turkey, but the Vinča were the first Anatolians, so they're related to the Cretans and the Romans. The Starchevo might originally have come from the Middle East and arrived by way of Turkey. Here you see the Vinča went out of their way to stay connected to the Aegean Sea. Not so much with the Starchevo. It was probably during this phase that we were gearing up to settle in the Cyclades. Sopot culture emerged from the Vinča. This one endured for 14 centuries, the record by 400 years, 5200 to 3800 BC. And as we just seen, it's also about 5200 BC that people started settling permanently on the Cyclades Islands. And remember, the Vinča would still be around for another 700 years. These are the same people. For some unknown reason, these Anatolian farmers, like the farmers before them, were unable to stay in their former southern domains. So just like the farmers before them, they moved north, creating the Lengyel culture, 5000 to 4300 BC. The Sopot stayed on long after the Lengyel had been replaced by the Lengyel, 4300 to 3800 BC. Here, after a presence of 17 centuries, we Anatolians start to disappear from the Balkan Peninsula. After the Sopot are gone, we're gone with them. As I'll show you, our relatively short stay in this part of the world was a spectacular success. As a Christian, I would say we accomplished our mission and moved on to the next one. But first, let me make the case that it really is us who are in this part of the world. Let's get a close look at this territory using a modern map. Here's the northern part of the Vinča. They were known for their figurines, as we would be on the Cyclades later. They also traded flint from Hungary for various shell products from Greece that they used for jewelry, so they never lost contact with the old homeland. Here are the Sopot, who came from the Vinča, and the Lengyel, who came from the Sopot. Here's the DNA. Other than the G2A, who are very common for farmers in Europe, this paper doesn't have any for the Vinča, but it does for the Sopot and the Lengyel. J2A like me, and E1B. These are two groups of men who migrated together to the Middle Volga and to Crete. This map is of all the E1Bs, and thus we have a third node to link up the other two we already know about. Our presence here resolves the mystery of this migration. I pointed out before that as the Romans, we got along very well with the primitive people we came across when we first moved to central Italy. We did on Crete, and it looks like we did here too. This is a very old bloodline that disappeared with the Starchevo and the LBK. It reemerges with us out of thin air, and as you can see, they carried on briefly even after we pulled up roots and moved away. Here are a couple of R1Bs, which you might assume came from the steppes. The problem is, these men are M343s. They could have just as easily come along with us. It's a very ancient line. When we looked at the J2A and E1BY chromosome maps, we saw a potential Anatolian trade route. How does it hold up here? I think this paper clinches the argument. When you track mitochondrial DNA, which all of us get from our mothers, and which can tell us where Anatolian men got their wives, you can see our trade routes plain as day. That's why I adjust them at the beginning of this segment. You could even tell that these are Anatolian routes. Here's the map of Starchevo mitochondrial DNA compared to modern populations of women. We should be over here if we were actually in the central Volga region during the Neolithic. There's a little patch showing up around Moscow. Now we're moving into the linear band ceramic and the LBKT. We're picking up steam here. Remember, the Vinča turned up only about 100 years after the LBK did. Under the Sopot, the whole thing is lit up. And as you can see, we're almost certainly moving in and out of Tatarstan. Running around on these trade routes is a young man's gig. I doubt very many of them brought their wives along. They probably met them on the road, and then they both ended up in southeastern Europe. It holds up very nicely under the Lengyel. And then, Just as we start pulling out, the pattern breaks, as we can see with the Balaton Lacinja culture.
Now, we can't assume that just because the Anatolians disappeared, the trade started to disappear. I actually think it's the other way around. When we established the routes, there was something of a cultural vacuum, but under our tutelage and after a little bit of intermarriage, the local hunter gatherers started to acquire a cultural center of gravity of their own. So the trade dried up as they learned to meet their own needs, or they took over the routes themselves. There's evidence the climate in the Balkans also started to dry up. So we took the cosmic hint and moved on to bigger and better things, and the whole enterprise disappeared into history, until now. Now, I haven't been idle about the people living in the Volga. Unfortunately, we're still at the very beginning of the process here.
I found this paper, Interdisciplinary Research of the Neolithic Volga-Kama Pottery. We know the people there came from the south, which supports my case, but very little else. Give it another decade or so. I'm sure we're in for some surprises.
Now, remember when I told you we were a spectacular success in the Balkans? Well, hang on to your hat because I'm about to deliver a couple of shocks to your system. I know I was shocked and very gratified. I'm about to annihilate one of the main pillars of support for the argument that the Indo-European language came from the steppes of Russia.
Down here in the Vinča territory, at the bottom in the center, the first provable case of copper making at high temperatures. In Sopot and Lengyel territory, right above that to the left, the first known metal objects on Earth.
That's right, we launched the Bronze Age, but we didn't rest on our laurels.
On the left, just outside of Lengyel territory, the first known wheel in the history of the world. And at the top, just to the right of center in Poland, the first artistic rendering of a wheeled cart in the known history of the world. And in the middle of all of it is where the Krepeks are from.
Right again, we invented the wheel. This probably happened during the largely non-Anatolian Lacinja period by the reckoning of this study, but the Lacinja weren't in Poland. Their territory shifted towards the west. And remember, the Sopot were here all this time. These two locations do perfectly bracket the old Lengyel territory, though, as you just saw, and they're not very close together. In fact, they're spread very far apart.
It takes 3 hours to cover that distance in a jet airplane, more than 8 hours driving a car, and this is on modern roads. So the center of gravity is definitely with the Anatolians.
I decided in favor of the Anatolian origin of the wheel as I surveyed the cultural evidence. Most linguists use the wheel as proof that the Indo-European language started on the steppes of Russia. Now watch carefully as I flip the argument on them.
This is from the Indo-European homeland from linguistic and archaeological perspectives. Axles cannot exist apart from wheeled vehicles, so a word meaning axle in late Proto-Indo-European is evidence that wheeled vehicles existed during the period when late PIE was spoken.
The instant I read this, I knew we invented the wheel. I knew we were on Crete, and I knew we were in Turkey, and I knew we didn't do it at any of those places, but I knew we invented it. I didn't say anything at the time because I couldn't nail enough details. This is where my cultural case comes into play. Okay, we're the Romans, and we speak Latin. Latin is an Italic language, and with us, the axle came before the wheel.
The stars don't just pass over the world at night, they circle over it like a wheel. That quiet spot in the center, the Greeks called the omphalos, the navel. But that's not what we called it. We called it the axis mundi, the pivot around which heaven turns. And there you have it, an axle and a wheel, before the wheel and axle.
After I read Széchenyi-Nagy's dissertation, and after I threw other sources in with my own research, I finally knew where we invented the wheel. Without the DNA, we couldn't have been sure. I suspected these people were Anatolians because of their figurines. Now I know they were. But I don't like to say we invented the wheel. I do because it gets your attention. The problem I have with the phrase is it has a transactional and utilitarian burden, and when you go with that, you miss the magic. I know you've heard of projection. Projection is typically a bad thing because most people abuse it. They project their unconscious psychic contents onto the world and expect the world to fall in line with those projections. It's sad, and oh my God, it wears me the hell out. But projection is a gift from God. It's the rope He throws us to pull us out of the muck. The story of the wheel is the story of projection used to the glory of God.
We were obsessed by the rotation of the stars around the center, a classic signal of projection. And like all projections, there's no obvious point. How can there be? Projection by definition points to something unconscious. But when you follow up on your projections, you are rewarded with enlarged consciousness. In this case, we knew, in our hearts, as above, so below. Just like the stars circle over your head, your noose circles around its own center of gravity. This is your mind, your intellect.
Wisdom begins with knowing thyself, and thyself is patterned after the stars. So hold your head up, look the world in the eye. You are your Father's son.
Yes, we got the wheel out of this, but we also got subtle psychological tools we carried with us to Crete. And this was the beginning of Western philosophy.
But I got a strong suspicion we got something else out of this. Let's look at those stars again.
Right here. What's in that center? Stars might circle around it, and every once in a while a star might occupy it, but the center never wanders. It's like all of these stars, divinities in their own right by ancient reckoning, are dancing around the one that rules them all.
I believe these Balkan Anatolians might have been the world's first monotheists, although more than likely they would have been henotheists. A henotheist accepts the reality of other divinities, but at the end of the day, there's only one God, one sure ground of reality. In working through the Festus disc in the Children of Proteus, I theorized that my ancestors on Crete might have been henotheists. Now that I know what we were up to before we showed up on Crete, I think I've strengthened the case for that. The case is strengthened further when you look at the later writings of Greek philosophers, pondering the spinning of the universe, who might have retraced our steps.
One of my major resources for my next big video series is A New History of Western Philosophy by Anthony Kinney. He has a very gratifying quote from Plotinus, the last great pagan philosopher before the rise of Christianity. Any statement about the one is really a statement about its creatures. We are well aware of our own frailty, our lack of self-sufficiency, and our shortfall from perfection. In knowing this, we can grasp the one in the way that one can tell the shape of a missing piece in a jigsaw puzzle by knowing the shape of the surrounding pieces. Or, to use a metaphor closer to Plotinus' own, when we, in thought, circle around the one, we grasp it as an invisible center of gravity. Most picturesquely, Plotinus says, "It is like a choral dance. The choir dances round the conductor, sometimes facing him, and sometimes looking the other way. It is when they are facing him that they sing most beautifully. So, too, we are always around him. If we were not, we would completely vanish and no longer exist. But we are not always facing him. When we do look to him in our divine dance around him, then we reach our goal and take our rest and sing in perfect tune."
As for the wheel itself, it was a wonder of the world long before it was ever put on a chariot or a sports car. With its creation, we reached up to heaven and brought a little bit of it down to earth. And who lives in heaven? The gods do. And now they live among us.
Once I made this connection, I realized the gods didn't just ride chariots because they were fast. They were gods. They don't need a chariot to get around fast. They were on chariots because, as incarnations of heaven on earth, they could live in our world and still stay in theirs. Or, since heaven was now on earth, God could call us back home, as the Lord received Elijah into his kingdom while still in bodily flesh. I've said more than once that, in the Old Testament, the Jews are the play, we are the stage. Throw in the wheel, and the pattern grows in authority.
And long after the play moves on, the stage endures. To me, this confirms the authority of Christian scripture. Nobody but God could embed a pattern like this in a literary work like this, pulled together as it was by 100 different hands. And let's not forget, we invented metallurgy too.
King Solomon's temple was an Anatolian temple, Hittites specifically. Flanking its entrance were two bronze columns named Boaz and Jachin. This column motif is Hittite. The bronze, we now know, is Vinča, as is the bronze sea that the priests washed in, and the bulls the sea sat on were likewise Anatolian.
Another thing that told me we probably invented the wheel was the fact that we were obsessed with the wheeling motion on Crete. There are variations of the swastika all over the island.
The Festus disk was a swastika, and as we came across the Cyclades on the way to Crete, a lot of us were buried with these strange artifacts. Archaeologists call them frying pans because that's what they look like. They also look like pre-literate versions of the Festus disk, don't they? A canoe in the Aegean Sea, another sea of stars overhead, and maybe reflected in the water below. This might look familiar. Starry night. We had the world's first Van Gogh.
Let me recap what I said about all this spinning in the final part 4 of Working Through the Festus Disk. The Minoans understood that in worship there are two parties, the divinity who is worshipped and the one who worships. And how can we, the worshipper, worship the Lord our God with all of our heart and all of our soul and all of our strength and all of our mind if we are divided against ourselves, plagued by personality fragments and complexes that deflect our conscious intentions and scatter our focus? How do we know one of these fragments isn't leading us right off of a cliff? This is the meta-genius of the Festus disk. It bears a hymn to properly orient us towards divinity and a ritual to properly approach it. But all of this is embedded in a whirling and a spinning, a swastika, like a whirling dervish. Have you heard of those? That's a very famous Sufi order. And do you know where the first dervish whirled? In Konya, our Stone Age homeland where Catalhayuk is. The actual mystic who did it is an Iranian, whose family fled the city of Balkh in northern Afghanistan during the Mongol invasion. Balkh itself is an important center of Zoroastrianism and Buddhism. Zarathustra himself died there. The mystic is also a world-famous poet, and you might have heard of him, Rumi, because when he lived in Konya, people called it Rum, which is Arabic for, can you guess it? Rome. Bring it home, boys. Do you know what else whirls and spins like a swastika? You do. Our very bodies are spun together like thread. The Minoans love discs and swirls and swastikas. Here's the Malia stone altar. It looks like the sun. It even looks like the symbol for Ka. There is a hole in the center, one large libation depression on the edge, and 33 libation depressions to cover the circumference of the circle. I looked up the number 33 to see if it meant anything. It seemed to in the earliest parts of the Old Testament, which just might mean we're looking at another Minoan/Hittite influence on the Israelites. Here's our friend, the Uktos libation table, reminding us that it was another swirl. Here's a ring recovered from a site on Crete. Here's the Magliano disc. The language is Etruscan, spoken by the people who were Rome's northern neighbors. It seems to bear instructions on how to properly offer libations to deities, just like the Festus disc. More swastikas, more whirls. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Minoan colony of Miletus was the home of Greek philosophy. The city was founded by Minoans and named after a Minoan city, and was full of Minoans. Later, Luwian-speaking Carians moved into the area from south-central Anatolia, our original homeland. Then followed Ionian Greeks, with whom we'd been living and intermarrying for thousands of years. Miletus was near Doric Greek sites in Anatolia. The Cretans were numbered among the Doric Greeks. Also, too, obviously not a coincidence, one of the earliest stirrings of Greek philosophy mentions the nous, the mind. If I were a betting man, I'd say nous is another Minoan word. And how does the nous move? It spins, like a galaxy, just like the Festus disk, just like the words on this Minoan cup. Anaxagoras of Clazomene, born about 500 BC, is the first person who is definitely known to have explained the concept of a nous, mind, which arranged all other things in the cosmos in their proper order, starting them in a rotating motion, and continuing to control them to some extent, having an especially strong connection with living things. However, Aristotle reports an earlier philosopher from Clazomenae named Hermotimus, who had taken a similar position. Amongst pre-Socratic philosophers before Anaxagoras, other philosophers had proposed a similar ordering, human-like principle causing life and the rotation of the heavens. For example, Empedocles, like Hesiod much earlier, described cosmic order in living things as caused by a cosmic version of love, and Pythagoras and Heraclitus attributed the cosmos with reason, logos. The Greeks themselves didn't know where the idea of the noose and its spinning came from. Sounds like the murky past to me. Maybe not so murky anymore. Clazomenae is a bit north of Miletus, but it's still firmly embedded in the same cultural milieu. Millennia later, my favorite psychiatrist in the whole world would witness the same spinning motion. Carl Gustav Jung. CG to his friends. During those years, between 1918 and 1920, I began to understand that the goal of psychic development is the self. There is no linear evolution. There is only a circumambulation of the self. Uniform development exists at most, only at the beginning. Later, everything points toward the center. This insight gave me stability, and gradually my inner peace returned. I knew that in finding the mandala as an expression of the self, I had obtained what was for me the ultimate. Perhaps someone else knows more, but not I. Here's Dr. Jung as a young man, with his wife Emma, and as a old master. But there is a catch. There's always a catch, right? Your noose is only spinning if it's working properly. Otherwise, you're stuck. And may I remind, not prepared to fully worship the Lord. You might get frozen in your tracks, terrified you're going to lose everything or conclude you're unfixable, made too many bad turns. Or maybe you get past that and your whole world gets ripped to shreds, and you're left hanging over pitch blackness. Even the floor beneath you, gone. When you penetrate the bullshit propaganda passed off as history, you know that Catholic Christianity invented the modern world. That includes the scientific method and the university system. When we created the scientific method, we did it on our home turf, at the University of Padua in northern Italy.
Right in this region on the map of J2A Min in Europe. Do you see that dark green projection? That's where it is. And the E1b. This is the men with the M123Y chromosome. They were most likely our partners in crime during our adventures.
It was a Belgian bishop who gave us the Big Bang Theory, although he probably wasn't one of us. So this wouldn't be the last time you owed our priests a favor. It also wouldn't be the last time you completely missed the point with us and insulted us. This time with the idea that the people on the steppe might have invented the wheel and swooped into our territory and kicked our asses with their chariots. The same evidence we invented the wheel can also be used to prove we spoke an Indo-European language more than 1,000 years before we were supposed to.
Back here at the language paper, we see that linguists have shown 2 words were created in the Indo-European language for the wheel. One is derived from kweklos, which just means a spinning thing. The other is rotos, which means runner. It's where we get the word rotor from. English is ultimately a Germanic language, and our word wheel comes from kweklos. I'm going to concentrate on the 3 language families that just use the word rotos. Celtic in Italic, 2 sister languages, Latin is an Italic language, and Baltic and Slavic, 2 other sister languages. Russian is a Slavic language. Here that family is represented by the Lithuanian word ratas.
Lithuanian is a very old and very conservative language. If you spoke Lithuanian and used Greek verbs, somebody speaking the original Indo-European language might be able to understand you.
So let's go back to our map of mothers for the Anatolian Sopot. The Baltic languages like Lithuanian are here, but they used to go all the way to the Ural Mountains, so they would have included the territory here, that was obviously a very important trading partner of ours, and Tatarstan. Booyah! This territory here is very close to where linguists and archaeologists think the Celtic language came from. I say the Latin came from Crete, which we migrated to through the Cyclades. These are the Greek, Armenian, and Iranian languages. These languages are related and would have probably been mutually intelligible while we were the Sopot. The Iranian languages use both words. This is probably where the Germanic speakers were living when we invented the wheel. They also used both words. In my series, The Children of Proteus, I assumed the Phrygians were a product of Cretans living in Turkey and mixing with the local population. Now I can see they were probably Vinča and Lengyel expatriates like my ancestors on Crete. Thus, all three languages now line up perfectly and exactly as they should. Celtic, Phrygian, Latin. This, combined with our presence in European Russia, shows there is no need for a step theory to explain the origin of the Indo-European language. In the middle of all this is the people still living in our old homeland and speaking an older Indo-European language, Anatolian.
Not finished yet. Turns out we can get into the heads of the Vinča. One of their mysteries is what is known as Vinča script. It's something like writing, although it's doubtful they had a full writing system. They used it until about 3500 BC, long after we started pulling out of the Balkans. It seems to have left with us, as did the Bronze Age, by the way. The Balkans slipped back into the Stone Age after we left.
Here are some of the earliest symbols. And here's your runner. Circles. Spinning. They were obsessed with all of these, just like we Cretans were.
So pull it all together and you see that we probably did invent the wheel and speak an Indo-European language. The Vinča symbols mostly mark small tokens and property.
On Crete, we would do the same thing, but there we used hieroglyphics that were obviously inspired by the Egyptians. But we also had our own scripting symbols scholars call linear A, and they could have plausibly derived from Vinča script. We used a syllabary, so each symbol represented a syllable instead of a discrete sound unit like an alphabet. This is Da, Re, Te. We have the full running man, just like they do, although with us he seems to have slowed down to power walking. We have the full figure and the two-step abbreviation, just like the Vinča. Here's the Ka, which also seems to have been a riff on the swastika. On the Festus disc, it's represented by a round flower. The Ya is plausible here. They seem to like playing with partition rectangles. For the Minoans, I read this was actually one of their sliding doors. These two symbols might have actually been an inspiration for Wa, which is an animal skin on the Festus disc. The one on the left seems to be spread out. This one was a surprise. Noir, a bound prisoner. That was a striking image for me when I first started studying linear A. A bound prisoner, really? It seems to go all the way back to the Vinča. Su. The flying bird is all over the place, often squared. Se. That weird little stick hand. It also seems to have inspired U. The Su is also very striking. Is it a swirl? Is it a building or a room? There's just as much of a haze with the Vinča. It might be the memory of an old cultic building. Zo. And Ma, another front-facing animal, or human with us Minoans.
Another thing I thought was odd with the Minoans is how they used complicated symbols that they could have just as easily simplified, like the Ma that we just saw. It seemed like a lot of unnecessary work. But if these symbols have been handed down through a long tradition, I can see why they would want to hang on to them. Later they would be simplified with linear B used in Greece and linear C used on Cyprus. Something similar happened in China with Chinese ideograms after the communists took over. With this new information in mind, I'm going to revise one of the positions that I had in working through the Festus disc and the Children of Proteus.
Originally, I thought we passed through the Dodecanese, then the Cyclades, then on to Crete. Many of Crete's ancestors probably did. After that, our famed thalassocracy. But now, it's more likely we moved into the Balkans first. Then, migrated to northwest Turkey, where we would be known as the Phrygians. And who knows, maybe some of us went back to the old homeland, and from there we launched the Hittite Empire.
We would have remembered that we came from there, and at the time we could probably still understand their language.
Another indication that early Proto-Indo-European, the ancestor of both Anatolian and later Pi, cannot have existed so early is that the attested Anatolian and non-Anatolian Indo-European languages are similar enough to make the reconstruction of pi unproblematic. The early phase of pi from which Anatolian was derived might have been spoken before wheels were invented, but if so, that early phase must have been in the millennium immediately before wheels were invented, the 5th millennium BCE, and more comfortably, late in that millennium.
This isn't about face for me, but remember what I've been arguing against: an invasion or migration from the steppes of Russia. These are Anatolians going back to Anatolia and blending in, like the children of Proteus typically do. This scenario clears up a mystery for me. The Hittites built the best chariots in the world, and they were in the Iron Age when everybody else was still in the Bronze Age. If their ancestors had invented metallurgy and the wheel, this makes sense. Now, if after this you still want to believe the Indo-European language came from the steppes of Russia, I would like to point out that in working through the Festus disk, I showed that after 2100 BC, the only foreign influence on the Greeks came from Anatolia, and Anatolians living on Crete. The Székely paper pushes this influence back another 1,000 years. The people on the steppes of Russia have nothing to do with the Greek language. We had that land surrounded.
My own ancestors probably passed through the Cyclades. Then after we built the Roman Empire, a later ancestor moved to the Netherlands. Then another one moved to Hungary, right next door to the old Sopot turf. Then a later one still went on to Passaic, New Jersey.
I throw around a bunch of me and us and ours when I'm talking about the Vinča and the Hittites and the people who crossed the Cyclades, and I've actually been mocked for that. Who does this guy think he is, you might ask yourself? Well, I have a J2A M92 Y chromosome. My heritage is from Crete and Rome. And a few months ago, I found these interesting numbers on a spreadsheet on Iranian DNA ages.
This is the paper I got the spreadsheet from. Ancient Migratory Events in the Middle East. New clues from the Y chromosome variation of modern Iranians. Well, here we are on Crete. By their reckoning, we showed up about 2100 BC, plus or minus 1500 years. The Greek line is a lot older, so we're from the north. This is perfect timing and perfect direction. Here are the M67s. They went the opposite direction, south to north. We are a subclade of the M67s. And here are the Baloch in Iran and Pakistan. As you can see, they're very recent immigrants there. There are only 5 samples from my line from Crete, but I think we can pencil in a decent timeline here. The center point is 2100 BC. We'll add 15 centuries to stretch it back to 3600 BC. The Sopot ends at 3800 BC. About 3100 BC, we bring the Bronze Age to Crete. Looks good. About 2700 BC, we started pouring in large numbers. We deliver sophisticated, high-end products to the local population. Then, about 2200 BC, there's a major population collapse on the Cyclades. And sure enough, that's right at the midpoint.
The population also cratered in eastern Crete and on the Greek mainland. The old kingdom of Egypt collapsed. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia collapsed. There was a drought in East Africa. Something bad happened. Nobody knows for sure. The cultural timing is also interesting.
Linear A shows up in the archaeological record right after we move in. If this scenario is a true guide, we haven't found the earliest examples yet. Hieroglyphics don't show up for another 400 years.
Like most people, I had assumed the Minoans learned about writing from Egypt, so hieroglyphics make sense. And I do think the Egyptians showed us how a proper writing system works. But I think we looked at their system and the cuneiform they used in Mesopotamia and we said, no thanks, we can do better. So we used our Vinča symbols to create the world's first sane writing system. Later, as the Philistines, I think we invented the alphabet. Actually, in working through the Festus disk, I think I proved that. So with this new information in mind, I would like to revise another one of my positions. This one on how my people fit into the larger Cretan society after they moved there 4 millennia ago. Until this segment, I assumed we happen to have access to the latest whiz-bang technology, and we used that as a wedge to fit in. Now that I see we were probably the southern branch of an authentic European proto-civilization, I suspect we did a little bit more than fit in. I think we took over the island, and I think the native Cretans resented that. So here's why I think Minoan civilization disappeared from Crete.
My adjustment is prompted by a confusing situation, the Sisseigny-Nagy dissertation, and now by this. Colonial cups, the Minoan plain handleless cup as icon and index. Here's what I've pulled together from this new information, then the conclusions I drew from them. We spoke Italic. The language on the Festus disk is obviously Italic. Linguistic analysis proves the original Cretans could not have spoken an Indo-European language. The language family is far too young. The Linear A language, aside from the odd ritual word and phrase borrowed from Italic, is the original Cretan language. This is why I haven't been able to make any sense out of it. In the second palatial period, about 1700 BC, the city of Knossos grew in stature at the expense of rival cities. By 1600 BC, simple, conical, well-made cups suddenly pop up all over Crete, the Cyclades, and in the critical Turkish cities of Iassos and Miletus. In 1450 BC, virtually all Cretan palaces are in ruins, except for the palace at Knossos. There is a flip to Greek culture and language so abrupt that we thought Crete was successfully invaded by mainland Greece. In a baffling development, strontium isotope analysis of the bones of the Greek invaders proves these are in fact local Cretans. These are the conclusions that I draw. Crete was emerging as a unified state. The Greeks knew we would rival Egypt and the Hittite Empire in military competence, especially when you factor in our new Italian colonies. The native Cretans wanted to get out from under our thumb. The Greeks and the native Cretans cut a deal. Those of us unwilling to live under the new status quo migrated to central Italy. Some of us tried to make a go of it with Akhenaten in Egypt. The Bronze Age collapse of 1250 BC, 200 years after the Revolution, made all of these moves irrelevant.
If my race has to be remembered by history for only one thing, I hope it is our great spiritual and psychological depth. We are not great because we're wealthy or clever. We are great because of this depth, and we carry it with us wherever we go, even when we are broke-as-a-joke nobodies like me. We have been violent. We've been vain. We've been greedy. But we are still a soulful race. We've had our flash and dash, but we typically try to make our way in the world honorably, and we like to leave the world a better place than we found it. And I think as a race, we have succeeded. I don't think anybody can seriously challenge our millennia-long record. Not the Germans, not the Jews, not the blessed Chinese who any day now are going to take over the world. Just as soon as they get the bow and arrow, the chariot, iron, industrialization, the computer chip. But don't take my word for it. Look into our eyes. Our great depth looks right back at you.
With the Vinča, notice the triangular heads, the pointy beards, and those eyes. The Vinča had neighbors, the Hamangia, also from Anatolia, also masters of the art. We carried the Vinča traditions with us, triangular heads and all with some of us, which I also thought was odd, and now it makes sense. We're not the kind of people who want to let go. And what's the hurry? 1,000 years is a twinkle in God's eye. We have time. Strangely attired and coiffed goddesses, like these from the Cambridge history. That one on the right, just as we had the world's first Van Gogh. We are the world's first Cubist, a Picasso of our very own, the art of the sublime, the uncounted and uncountable mythos of our psyche, our great depth. Lo, there do I see my father. Lo, there do I see my mother, and my sisters, and my brothers. Lo, there do I see the line of my people back to the beginning. Lo, they do call to me. They bid me take my place among them, in the halls of Valhalla, where the brave may live, eternal,